But first, the latest virus emergency in Melbourne. Again, I've got to ask, why have we got our quarantine hotels right in the middle of our biggest cities? Why, when it takes just one small outbreak to shut that city and affect millions of people? Why aren't these hotels out in the country in smaller places? Last year, the virus got out of 2 Melbourne quarantine hotels and shut down the city, 5 million people for months. Huge cost. Last month, the virus got out of a Brisbane quarantine hotel, again, right in the middle of the city, and shut down that city for 3 days, 2.5 million people affected. And last week, the virus got out of a Perth quarantine hotel, and you guessed it, right in the middle of that city. 5-day lockdown, 2 million people affected. You'd think we'd learn a lesson. Now the virus has escaped yet another quarantine hotel, and again in Melbourne. In fact, this hotel could not be more central. It is right in Collins Street in the CBD. And what happened then is exactly the danger when you put these hotels right in the middle of a busy city with millions of people all around. Because let me show you. The person who got sick was there in that hotel to look after the 600 or so players, helpers, officials who were there for the Australian Open, plus others. We're told he didn't do anything wrong. And we're told that by a premier who claims that he didn't do anything wrong either. This just happened.
We can find no problem, no breach of protocol, anything of that nature in terms of his employment.
Now, as it turns out, this bloke who got infected is a hyperactive guy, a real metrosexual, the kind of guy you will find in the city, I guess. In the couple of days between his last test and when he felt sick, he was very responsible, reported that and all that. But in those days, he crisscrossed a lot of the southern part of Melbourne, to a Bunnings, to 2 Kmarts, to 2 supermarkets, a hotel, a cafe, several shops and some sports centres. Well, now the city is shut down. No, not this time. At least it seems our politicians are finally thinking that enough, there may be enough. I mean, one case you can shut down Perth, but maybe not this time Melbourne. So that bit's good. That bit's good. But masks must now be worn again in public places indoors. There's restrictions on gatherings and all that kind of stuff, and return to offices and all that kind of thing. Now, this outbreak would have been infinitely easier to deal with if the quarantine hotels weren't in our cities. Small town, shut a small town, you only affected much fewer people with fewer things to go and visit. And now we have to fix this, I think. We have to fix this. I mean, just saying, hey, the danger of having people return to Australia in these quarantine hotels in the cities is actually small, get perspective. I don't think that quite cuts it.
Some 210,000, to be specific, 211,550 people have returned to Australia through hotel quarantine arrangements since the 31st of March last year. 211,500. Now, there have been a number of cases, in the handful of cases, that have resulted in those quarantine arrangements not always being 100% perfect.
That's right. Perspective, there's only been a few outbreaks, but the point is these outbreaks have huge consequences. The ones in Melbourne last year, 800 people dead, right? It doesn't take much. Now, while we still have premiers who think, shut down the city, that's the way to deal with these things, we have a problem. And nor is the Prime Minister right to say, well, look, don't worry, because the vaccines will soon fix everything.
If the vaccines continue to show that sort of successful path on transmissibility, then that obviously has a big change in terms of what the future management of the virus is, not just here in Australia, but all around the world, how people can travel, how they can move about, how they can go to concerts, how life can potentially return to normal.
Now, the Prime Minister may be absolutely correct, but I don't think we should really kid ourselves, drink too much of the hope juice. The vaccines are great, they're going to do a lot of good, but they're not perfect. And this virus is mutating. The vaccines aren't as effective against some strains that are emerging, and we might need even updated vaccines for them, and more particularly for future mutations. And you've got to think too, there will be other pandemics. And in fact, I think we also got to consider the fact that we're still seeing 500,000 people a day around the world getting sick. There's been a slight dip, mind you, in the rise, so that's good. I mean, that's the first time in a year, so be grateful. But 500,000 a day is still a lot. And 40,000 Australians overseas still want to come home. The virus is still out there. As long as there are flights to Australia, there is a risk it will get out of our quarantine hotels. So, our health minister is right. The answer isn't shutting down all flights back to Australia, which is, in fact, the main and only way that the virus gets here.
We have to keep a perspective. So long as there's a pandemic, and unless Australia were hermetically sealed, no Australians returning for funerals, for families, for work, no Australians returning for weddings or births, no Australians being able to go overseas with the expectation that they'd come back after meeting up with their own families, no trade, no wool, no wheat, no iron ore going abroad.
So, what do we do? Now, the funny thing is, of course, when we had 50,000 boat people coming here illegally, our politicians had no trouble at all sticking them in the bush, Christmas Island, Tasmania, wherever, they just spread them out. Now, I get some of the counter-arguments about doing that again with the returning tourists and Australians. Well, not many foreign tourists, for sure. Now, for one, a lot of the hotels are near empty because of the virus, and turning them into quarantine hotels saves them and is cheap. So that's good. And of course, you know, what are you going to do? You fly them into a Sydney and what? Then they transfer and you get them out to... That maximises some other risks of transmission. But I think you've got to figure out that the expense of fixing this will be high, but the expense of shutting down cities is enormous, horrendous. And now there are, belatedly, suggestions that maybe there is a better way. Now, the federal government does already have a quarantine centre outside Darwin at Howard Springs, in an old workers' camp. That's good. Now the Queensland government is wondering about having another quarantine hotel, not in Brisbane, but in Toowoomba, much smaller, easier to cut off, at an airport there. Much easier to handle the virus if it gets out, although accommodation, I'm told, is still a problem. And that's going to be discussed with the Morrison government, no doubt. The Queenslanders will be shaking the begging bowl, federal money. Now, maybe we can get away with what we've got. Okay, maybe the vaccine is going to protect us enough. Maybe we will deal with future outbreaks without shutting cities. Maybe the virus will peter out. Who knows? Maybe, or maybe not. Because already in the past month, 2 cities shut, 1 hit with more restrictions. And all from outbreaks in quarantine hotels in the centre of those cities, when they could be miles away, safely out in the bush.